CORS, or Cross-Origin Resource Sharing, is another feature available in this version of Web API after a quick NuGet download of a Microsoft package. CORS allows JavaScript in a browser to call an API on a different domain, so it calls an API on a different server somewhere different from its origin. For years, a cross-domain call would simply be blocked by a browser and disallowed as a security risk, but it's extremely useful to be able to do this. And these days, the browser will let the call go through as long as the other server allows it. For the other server to allow a call, it has to return some HTTP headers in a response that tells the browser the call is legal and allowed. The way this works is that when a browser makes a request to another domain, it will send along an origin header with the value of the domain that it came from. So if you're on pluralsight.com and pluralsight.com downloads a script and that script tries to make a connection to some other site, say Facebook, the Pluralsight script will connect and will say origin pluralsight.com. If Facebook allows this, it will send back an HTTP message with a header named access control allow origin, and that header will say, yes, I allow pluralsight.com to access this resource. If that header is not present, then the browser will not allow the JavaScript to receive that response. Let's see if we can get this working in our application. Back in Visual Studio, let's first write a CORS client and see how it behaves before we enable CORS in the Web API. So I'm going to create a new project, actually add it to the solution. It'll be another ASP.NET web application. So that will be hosted on a different port. And to the browser, that means it's on a different origin. I'll call this one CORS client. And this one, we don't need anything fancy. So I'm going to use the empty project template and select OK. And when we say empty, we really mean empty. There's a web.config in here, and that's about it. And in order to keep this as simple as possible, I'm going to Control-Shift-A, add just a simple HTML page, call it default.html. And I'm also going to need some jQuery. So let me manage my NuGet packages for this project and say that I want to install jQuery. That's finished. So inside the HTML, before I forget, I will add my jQuery script. I'm also going to have my own script. But before I do that, let me put together some UI. So maybe a bit of a header, perhaps a button that a user can click. I'll give it an ID of get patients. And it'll just have the text get patients. And then I want someplace to put output. I just want to dump raw output onto the screen, raw JSON, and that would look best inside of a pre-tag. So now for my script. When the DOM is ready, I want to execute some code. I want to go out and I want to find get patients. And I want to wire up the click event to a function, call it get patients. So get patients is a function that will need to make an AJAX request to that other website, and then I need to return false just in case this ever gets hooked up to, say, like an input type equals submit that would prevent the browser from navigating somewhere. But what URL do I want to call? Well, let's say I just want to call my web API and get all patient data. That would be going to localhost 28.861/API/patients. Let me take that URL and include it here as a configuration parameter. And now inside of get patients, I could say, let's do a $.get on the URL. And then no matter what happens, whether it's an error or success, I always want to call a function called showResponse. And I just want that to dump out the raw result. So showResponse is a function that will take some object. And what I'll do is just go out and find the output div, or the pre actually, and set its text. And what do I want to set the text to? Well, since I'm only going to run this in Chrome, I can be sure there is a json.stringify method. I can say stringify that object. I don't need any replacer. Use 4 spaces for indentation. But now I should be able to right click on this and run this by running it in Google Chrome. And notice it's on localhost 32.275. And that is a different website than localhost 28.861. So when I do that GET request with jQuery, it's going to have to cross domains. Let me open up the developer tools in Chrome by pressing F12. We'll go to the network tab and let me say get patience. And a couple things to notice here. The response that came back was basically a 404. A 404 is an error. Notice in the network status that that request did go out, but that the status is canceled. The status is canceled because we did send a header out that says here's the origin, but the response didn't allow it. In fact, an error showed up here in Chrome. If I open that up, it will explicitly say that the XML HTTP request cannot load that. The origin is not allowed by the access control allow origin. So this is what we're going to have to fix by tweaking Web API a little bit to get this to work. So back in the project, let's switch over to the patient data project. I'll manage NuGet packages again. This time I went to search for a CORS package, the Microsoft ASP.NET Web API CORS package. We will install that. And with that installed, it's very easy to enable CORS. There's a couple different ways to do it. One way is to go into my Web API config, and now that that package is installed, I should be able to say enable CORS. And one of the things I can do with CORS is I can actually create a new enable CORS attribute that is in the system.web.http CORS namespace. It's inside of here where I could pass in some parameters that essentially say, what are the allowed origins? For instance, I could say pluralsight.com is an allowed origin, or I could just say star, everything is an origin. What are the required headers that I need to see? I could say allow anything. What are the required methods? I could say only allow get, or only allow get and post. So if you have multiple things to set in here, you can separate them with commas. We're basically going to allow get requests from any origin, anywhere. That would be one way to do this. I could pass in CORS to enable CORS. Another way to do it is to enable it selectively on specific controllers by using that enable CORS attribute. So I could say enable CORS, again, system.web.http.CORS namespace. And now I can pass in origins. We'll take everything, headers, and just get requests. Now let me do a build. And now let's come back out to our client. Make sure the developer tools are still open. Let me reload the page just to refresh everything and click Get Patience. And now we get our patient information back. And you can see down here when we called /API/patients, we got back a 200 status. If I drill into that request, there's the request headers where we sent along the origin. Here's the response that basically says access control allow origin. Anybody can call this endpoint. And that's how easy it is to enable CORS, which is very useful in this world where single page applications often have to call APIs on different servers. You have mashups, you're grabbing data from everywhere. The secret is all in that access control allow origin header.